right. This is a first for me to talk about trauma this early in the day and while eating breakfast. But what's great is we're going to be talking about how to heal from trauma. And so it's a message full of hope. As you remember, yesterday we talked about conceal and seal the invisible wounds of trauma. So what that means is many times we stuff, we repress, we hide, we avoid addressing the trauma, which leads to those wounds. But today there's a threefold step process to heal. We first kneel, then we ask God to reveal those wounds, and then God can then step in and begin to heal us. So kneel, reveal, and heal, the journey to trauma recovery. So we're going to jump right into the first step of kneeling. So the first step of receiving healing is coming to God. And I love Psalm 139 that says, "Search my heart, O God, know my heart." Right? Try me, know me. We cannot fully know ourselves. We are very good at self-deceiving. Some people believe that we self-deceive about 10 to 200 times a day. That's a lot. Whether it may be something as small as that one little cookie won't hurt, or something as large as trauma. I'm okay, it's everyone else. We have a lot of defense mechanisms and other things that we use to deceive ourselves that I'm okay. And so we need to come before God and ask him to search me. He's the only one who can really know our hearts. And I love Acts chapter 2, comparing it to Acts chapter 7, because we see, although different stories, similarities as well as contrasts. In Acts chapter 2, what happens in Acts chapter 2? The Pentecost. And what we see is there's this sermon, and they come with burning hearts, and they say, what must we do to be saved? Acts chapter 7, what happens in Acts chapter 7? The stoning of Stephen. They hear a sermon, but what do? It says that they stop their ears. So notice, both similar experience of being convicted. It actually uses the phrase, cut to the heart. But notice the difference in response. One person said, "Wow, I see my need of Jesus and healing. What must I do?" And the other stopped their ears. I see this all the time. An individual who comes to therapy and says, "What must I do to be healed?" And another who may even still come, but has a hardened heart. And what research shows is that what's the number one predicting factor of success in therapy is not the type of therapy, is not the therapist, it's how committed a patient is. And we see this. You can ask any provider when someone is hungry for healing, not just in the context of therapy, but in our spiritual journey, in anything. When we're hungry and desperate, that's when we see success. So come to God saying, God, search me. I have a problem. I need help. Do I need healing? Now, sometimes we go to God, but sometimes also God comes to us. I'm reminded of Genesis chapter 3, where he goes to Adam and Eve. Sometimes we're hiding. And with trauma, whether ourselves or people we know, they themselves might be hiding. As well as in John chapter 5. I love that Jesus comes to the man that had an infirmity of 38 years, and he says, "Do you want to be made whole?" So sometimes God does come to us, pursuing us, even if we don't come. And so I want you to reflect on this question. Are there any experience, including people that have come into my life that maybe God has placed to show me that I need healing? And oftentimes, this isn't a very pleasant experience. Often it's very rebuking. Did someone in church come to me and say, "Hey, we have this conflict and I'm concerned"? Do you turn away and say, "Oh, that's that person's fault"? God may be placing people and experiences in your life to show you that you have wounds, but sometimes, and if we're all honest, it's hard to admit that we do have those wounds. I'm going to give you some, little tips that you can start self-assessing. First, a general one. This could be applicable to any mental health difficulties, not necessarily trauma. And then I'll give a very specific trauma self-assessment. So you can start asking yourself, how's my daily functioning? Whether at school, at work, at church, home, relationships, what's my energy level like, sleep, etc. Now, we're not talking about once in a while. You can ask me once in a while, yep, my sleep routine is off, but daily functioning. What is my overall day-to-day look like? Do I struggle in these areas? If you say, I notice that I consistently have problems in my relationships, that might be a sign. I like to use cognitive behavioral therapy, this approach of looking at our behaviors, our thoughts, and emotions, because it kind of clearly and easily separates these three things. So you can first take a look at your behaviors. How are my habits? Diet, exercise, self-care, but also thinking about behaviors of addictions. Do I struggle with media addiction? Do I struggle with porn, eating, overworking, etc.? Emotions. How is my mood most days? If you say my mood most days are anxious and down and so forth, that may be a sign. Thoughts. What's the trend of my thoughts? Are they predominantly negative? You can ask yourself, what percentage of my thoughts are negative, irrational, etc.? Now, specifically with trauma, first just ask the question, and this is why the first presentation was necessary, have I experienced trauma? That's an important question to ask. Later on, I'll mention, because some people, and this is important, also related to some of the questions that was asked on the panel, just because you've experienced trauma does not mean that you're going to have mental health difficulties from trauma. And I'll talk about that a little bit later on. But just start with the question, have I experienced trauma? Now, can I think or talk about my trauma or traumas without a strong urge to avoid? You might say, yes, so there's some people who say, yes, I experienced XYZ trauma in childhood, and they can say it, and it's still maybe sad or hard to say, but not this, I can't talk about it, it comes with a lot of shame, I'm not going to let anyone know. How do I feel when I think or talk about it? Am I triggered frequently? Are these triggers perhaps related to my trauma? Let's say you start noticing, I love the perspective of thinking about triggers as opportunities to reflect within. You say, oh, that person triggered me. Not that person, has nothing to do with them. It has to do with what in me is affected by that person. So you want to start reflecting, and just know that the steps I'm going over to today is a journey. That's why I said a journey of trauma recovery. So don't just take all this home and say, okay, I have to do everything today. It's a process. Come before the Lord, and the Lord will reveal what's going on in your life. So step one was kneel. Step two, reveal. We're now asking God to specifically reveal to us. That's the try me and know my anxieties part of Psalm 139. And I want you to remember that we can only heal by knowing what we know and feeling what we feel, right? We can't fully experience healing without taking the full approach of being revealed to us what we're struggling with. Now, what exactly is the problem? So this is what I was mentioning a little bit earlier about the problem is not as we think it is. So you might say, oh, my addictions, anxiety, depression, fill in the blank. But many times, as I mentioned yesterday, that's symptom focused, not root focused. So if the root is trauma, many times people say, my problem is trauma, period. But that's a yes and no answer. Notice this, if it was solely the trauma, then every single person would develop PTSD and other related diagnoses following a traumatic event. A lot of research has been done to recognize, after a traumatic event, how come not everyone develops PTSD? A great example of this was 9/11. 9/11 was very traumatic, and yet, notice here that only about 5% had PTSD 7 to 12 months after that event. Now, there's a lot of different kind of conversations and discussions about what particular traits in a person might make them vulnerable to developing PTSD. And there's nothing conclusive, because that's also sometimes where we try to blame the person. But what we know is that we all experience maybe traumatic, symptoms from a trauma, but we all naturally heal. That's why we cannot diagnose PTSD within the first month, because it's very common for everyone to have, they used to call it like kind of a shock syndrome, right? Because we're all kind of shocked. What we see here on the left are the three main categories of PTSD symptoms. You have the arousal part, a lot of the physical arousal. You have the intrusions. This is where you don't want to think about it. You may not want to, you might have even nightmares. And then you have the memory part. But over time, you notice what happens in recovery. The memory is still there. It is, right? We cannot forget what happened, but notice what happens. The arousal goes down, where I'm not, having this huge emotional experience every time I think about it, and the intrusions become less and less. This happens for a lot of people within the first month, and this can happen naturally for a lot of people. So the question is, what gets in the way of recovery? That's the better question. And I love this because if you think about it, God designed us to naturally heal. You see this even with the physical body. You stop smoking and immediately you see that a person starts to heal and recover from that behavior. But we now think, okay, God designed us to heal, but what gets in the way? What does Satan do to try to prevent this natural recovery? And that's what we refer to as avoidance. Avoidance. And I love these pictures because if you could try to see them clearly, they're little kids trying to hide. I love the one of the kid trying to hide behind the tree because they think they can't be seen, right? And oftentimes they think if they can't see you, you can't see them, but you can clearly see them. Avoidance is this idea of like, oh, I'm going to avoid my trauma. It's not going to be there. But does it really work? No. What are some examples of avoidance? Alcohol? It's a very common form of avoidance. Any others? Isolation? Yeah, especially if you're triggered by relationships or other people, you might avoid people, okay? Any others? Entertainment. That's a huge, huge form of avoidance. Okay, well, keep on chewing. Here's some more examples. You can think about any substances, alcohol, marijuana, caffeine, illicit as even prescribed drugs. But then there's a lot of behavioral. Oftentimes we think about addictions as just substances. But notice here, and my guess is there are some people here, especially sometimes within these circles, we say, oh, I don't struggle with substances. But many of us struggle with behavioral addictions. Notice eating, and that might be overeating, high amounts of sugar, over restriction. Shopping became much more of an addiction, especially now with online shopping as an option. I know a lot of people that they're like, oh, I was feeling sad, and so all of a sudden I found myself on Amazon. Because there's an element of avoidance. You get really into scrolling and trying to find different products. Media and entertainment, as was mentioned, even sleep. I have a lot of clients that try to avoid through sleeping. It's a perfect escape. Self-harm, even rumination. Some people think that they don't realize that rumination is a form of addiction. Amanda had mentioned that in her talk about worrying. We could be addicted to worrying. That can include suicidal thoughts and fantasizing, pornography, sex, and other relationships, including codependency. Many times people don't realize that codependency is a form of avoidance. Overworking, including overworking in ministry. I've known many people who avoid healing from trauma by overworking in ministry. Risky behaviors, and the long list continues. So avoidance gets in the way of recovery. What's the purpose of avoidance? It's escape, right? That's why people use it. And many times what my approach with people who struggle with these addictions is I empathize with them. Instead of saying it's wrong, it's wrong, it's wrong, I say I understand why you're trying to escape. It works, doesn't it? Yeah. Does it work? Yes and no. It works in the moment. And many times people turn to these things because they don't have any other way of coping. And we have to have sympathy and empathy. It works in the moment, but we know that long term it doesn't. I love this quote that says, we can ignore reality, but we cannot ignore the consequences of ignoring reality. It's similar to the idea of many times they're trying to avoid their emotions, but we have to realize our emotions don't kill us. The things we're using to avoid them kill us. And it's the whole premise behind Satan where the Bible says there's a way that seems right to a man, and in the end, there's destruction. So it seems right to the person. I don't know how to deal with all these emotions and this traumatic experience, and so we avoid. But let me ask you this. If you broke your arm, and I actually broke my wrist when I was playing football, flag football in high school, and it looked like this. Now, if I avoid going to the hospital, what's going to happen? It's going to stay that way. It's going to heal. It will. And a lot of people are like, I don't want to deal with it. I don't want to go to the hospital. So it heals, but it heals incorrectly. And then it starts to get more and more painful until finally people say, okay, I have to deal with it. That's typically how people, I don't want the pain, so I ignore it until it continues, it builds to a point where they say, I need to go to the hospital. And then what happens at the hospital? You have to re-break it, which is actually even more painful. The first time I heard of this analogy is when I was being trained in the VA for trauma. And I was working with veterans, and they were a classic example of this. Years, decades had gone by since their combat trauma, and they had been heavily, under the influence of alcohol, risky behaviors, doing all these things to avoid the trauma, high divorce rates, their life in shambles, until finally they'd come to therapy. And when they came, it was like seeing some of these veterans become little children again, deathly afraid of dealing with so many years, not just now of the trauma itself, but years of pain that followed. And this is what God wants. He wants us to heal as soon as possible because he doesn't want us to carry on that hurt and that pain. So instead of processing the trauma, which then leads to expressing, releasing the emotions, that's the arousal piece, and making sense of what happens. If you think about intrusions, the reason why our brain has intrusions is because trauma is stored in our brain as fragments. Did you know that? And those fragments are often sensory based. So I have a certain smell, I have a certain auditory memory, and it's fragmented. And so the intrusions are God's design to say, hey, this needs to be processed. This needs to come together in one cohesive narrative. And overall, integrating it into our memory storage as a complete memory. Think about, it's like as if you have a file cabinet, and when a trauma happens, the papers go everywhere. And so what we need to do is we need to pick up those papers and file them correctly. What happened? Why did it happen? And understand it in order to put it into our memory storage. But when we avoid, it leads to longer term pain. And it'll continue, the intrusions, the arousal, and so forth, because we haven't fully processed that experience. A man that flees from his fear may find that he has only taken a shortcut to meet it. And that's what happens with trauma. They're trying to avoid reliving the event, right? They don't want to deal with something that happened in the past, but what ends up happening is they're reliving it constantly, whether in the form of an actual intrusion, but also maybe in the form of relationships. And we see that there's many different consequences of avoidance. If avoidance then gets in the way of processing and healing, we need to then approach it. And this is the part people don't want to do, but we need to approach the trauma and process it properly. So step number 3, how do we heal in this journey? And that's the part of Psalm where it then says, and lead me in the way everlasting. Is that what you want? Amen. But we cannot get to that point unless we first ask God to search us, to try us, and to reveal, to see if there's any wicked way or anything in me that needs healing. In trauma, we often talk about that there's 3 stages of recovery. The first one is safety. The second one, remembrance and mourning. And the third is reconnection. And I'm going to go through each of these. So the first stage is safety. This is where before we start processing the memory, we have to make sure our life is stable. It's kind of like before you go to the past, you have to make sure the present is in shaky ground. Now, some of you may say, I am, good. I have good relationships. I have good behaviors and so forth. And so we could go to stage number 2. But many times my clients are heavily addicted to things. They're suicidal. Other things are happening that I need to make sure that they're first safe. This part can also include a lot of coping skills. If you have no idea how to cope, we won't want to bring up the past before you know and have skills enough to then cope in the present. But also an important part of this is decreasing unhealthy behaviors and increasing healthy behaviors. So as I mentioned, if alcohol or other addictions get in the way of processing, we need to remove that before we go on to processing. Later on, when I talk about the importance of writing out your trauma, I've had some clients who are trying to write out the trauma while drinking, or they're writing the trauma while watching TV because they're still trying to avoid. But we need to remove these things in order to have a better mind, a healthier mind, to then process. And I know Dr. Binus will talk more about this. And so just some quick little principles. I'm not going to go into the details. But first, decreasing unhealthy behaviors. And this is an important point. Before you heal someone, or before you yourself want to be healed, ask him or ask yourself if you're willing to give up the things that made you sick. Powerful. Because many times we say, God, I will do anything. I'm ready. But are we really willing to give up the things? And sometimes you're like, wow, God is asking me to sacrifice. But God's like, hey, that's not a sacrifice. That thing is hurting you. So are you willing? And this is not a 99% willing. It has to be 100% willingness to do whatever it takes. And I love this principle found in Matthew 5. I think it applies very well to addictions, where it says, if your right eye causes you to sin, what do? You say, I really like my eye. I think it has I want 2 eyes. I don't know about you, but I'd rather have 2 eyes. But if it causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. And it goes on to say about your right hand. If your right hand causes you to sin, what do? Because it says later on, for it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell. This applies to addictions in the sense that, are you willing to do whatever it takes because you know that eye, that hand, that addiction is going to lead you to hell, right? Not to literal hell, but emotional hell, right? You know that it's problematic for you. Are you willing to do whatever it takes? A great practical example of this was early on when I started doing clinical work. I was so impressed by a patient where he came in and he wanted to work on his pornography addiction. And he said, I'm willing to do anything it took. And he was serious. Not too long after, he got rid of his computer. He got rid of his smartphone. He said, I don't want anything. And those things are very convenient. They're very useful. But he at first tried to have certain websites and other programs that would limit. But he realized even then he found other ways that he said, it's not worth it to me to continue my porn addiction. I'm going to do whatever it takes. That's the principle found in these verses is, are you willing to do whatever it takes in order to find healing? Another great principle is found in Matthew 12, where it talks about, when an unclean spirit leaves, and then he comes back and finds the house in order, and what happens? 7 more come back, right? It's the principle that in the spiritual context that if we, get rid of something, but we don't fill ourselves with Christ, right, it can come back. This applies also to addictions. Many times, Amanda had mentioned this in her talk, that you can get rid of one, but then you transfer to another. What this is saying is, yes, we need to get rid of the bad, but you need to replace it with the good, which goes on to then these different health principles. And again, Dr. Bynus can talk more about this. And so this is where it's important. Yes, get rid of the bad, but you need to increase the good. It is important for you to exercise, have diet, not from a physical perspective, but I'm talking about from a mental health perspective. It's really hard to heal from trauma if you're not taking care of your body. At Beautiful Minds, we have a acronym, Choose Life. It's similar to those that may have heard of New Start, where we go through these principles with our patients. There's also some podcast episodes that go through each of these principles. But I encourage you, not out of a place of perfection, but how do I start incorporating these into my life to establish more safety? But stage number 2, this is the stage I'm going to focus most on, is the part that when we start to feel more stable, we need to then address and process the trauma. So we're telling the story of the trauma, which if you think about it, has a lot to do with grief. Trauma is very similar to grief. We have to look back, accept what has happened, grieve what has happened, and then move forward. And I'm going to be specifically talking about a type of therapy called cognitive processing therapy. Now, sometimes when people hear this talk, they leave here and they're like, I have to find a CPT therapist. Not a lot of therapists, are trained in CPT, but the principles are cognitive behavioral therapy. They're from CBT, but then so you don't have to look for a CPT therapist, but you can take these principles, apply it on your own, or take it to a therapist and say, I'd like to do something similar. So these are the different components of cognitive processing therapy. The first component is what we call an impact statement. And I'll go through each of these, and then trauma count and ABCs. But the CPT impact statement is trying to find, so let me back up a second. Remember that not everyone develops trauma. One of the main factors of which contributes to someone developing trauma is an incorrect narrative. So I had mentioned, for example, self-blame. If someone had an experience of childhood abuse and they said, I understand what happened, it wasn't my fault, they're not going to really struggle with trauma. But if they have an incorrect narrative, they said, it's my fault. What ends up happening, if you really think about it, is they became the perpetrator. If they say, I'm to blame, and then they themselves are walking around and living with themselves, the perpetrator. So it's not the trauma itself. This is a very important point. It's not the trauma itself. It's the narrative, the meaning we give the trauma that affects us. And therefore, this approach targets the actual experience, the narrative of the experience. So we start off in therapy by having them write a 1-page document, asking them, why did the trauma happen? This question is trying to gather perhaps that incorrect narrative. If they said, oh, it was because of me, or it's because, let's give another example. I've worked with EMT providers, and they said, I should have done more. I should have done. You notice the incorrect thinking. That's what the purpose of this statement is, to try to gather their incorrect beliefs. Then it's also important to reflect on, how did this trauma impact me in the areas of intimacy, trust, power and control, esteem, and safety? This is also trying to understand, Do they have incorrect beliefs in these different areas? For example, they may say in the area of trust, because trauma happened, I can never trust anyone anymore. That belief is going to continue the trauma and continue the negative effects. And so, as a clinician, I would say, okay, I need to both address the self-blame as well as the negative distrust of others. Or if they come out with a belief of, because of the trauma, I am completely powerless. Bad things happen to me and there's nothing I can do. They're going to start in everything in life have that belief. From a cognitive behavioral therapy standpoint, this is what we call core beliefs. But this one's specific to the trauma. And so what we do is we call these beliefs stuck points. These are beliefs that keep you stuck in trauma. And so we get a log and we write out all their stuck points that have come as a result of the trauma. This is from the manual talking about the importance of addressing these beliefs. By the time child and adolescent trauma victims receive therapy as adults, they may have settled on cognitions, thoughts that were constructed at a time when their executive functions were not fully developed. This is probably the reason why so many clients with PTSD have extreme beliefs and have been traumatized repeatedly. CPT may well assist such clients in developing affect regulation, increasing their cognitive flexibility, not rigid thinking, and changing many assumptions and beliefs that were developed at a period of cognitive immaturity and that were never re-examined because of avoidant symptoms. In Dr. Binus's talk, when he was talking about how of all the different types of abuse, emotional abuse is the worst, right? Telling a child you're worthless, they don't have a frontal lobe to be able to say that's not the truth. But what happens is they are like a sponge, they soak in those beliefs, and notice where it says it's never re-examined. I'm worthless? Okay, I'm worthless. And I just continue to live life and I never re-examine it. If I say I'm to blame for the abuse, I never re-examine it. And so much of therapy and healing is I need to re-examine. I need to put that belief on trial and have it a fair trial in order to know whether or not it's true. So here are some examples, more examples of stuck points. I already mentioned the self-blame. I am damaged forever because of the fill in the blank of trauma, right? You can already think about what are the effects of believing these things. I must be on guard at all times. This is what results with hypervigilance. And this belief comes from, maybe I wasn't on guard when the trauma happened, and therefore I'm going to cope and compensate by saying I need to be on guard at all times. Other people should not be trusted. God is punishing me. If I let other people get close to me, I'll get hurt again. I must control everything that happens to me. This, many times people don't realize that someone who may struggle with control issues, it might come from a place of intense fear that something bad again is going to happen. Expressing an emotion means I will lose control of myself. I see this a lot because what happens with the trauma is intense emotions, like a flood, like a tsunami of emotions. Many times they don't know how to then express it without themselves losing control. So then they continue to stuff. But what happens when you continue to stuff your emotions? It explodes. And so they get stuck in this cycle. The world is dangerous. This is a very common one. And I'm powerless, which often comes in the form of I can't stand this. I can't stand this. It's too much. And what we see is there's a combination often too of some of these. I often see the world is dangerous and I am powerless together. Imagine how much fear you will live with if you believe just these two beliefs. The world is dangerous and I am powerless. This is why, you think about different disorders like agoraphobia, people who don't leave their homes, don't want to be in public spaces. If they believe the world is dangerous and they can't do anything about it, they might be intensely afraid of even just leaving their homes. If you believe that you can't control your emotions, you might be afraid of having panic attacks. So we see that these stuck points are needed to be re-examined. So that was the impact statement, trying to find those stuck points. You can sit down and you can ask God, God, why do I believe, why did the trauma happen? What are my beliefs? And how has it impacted me in these different areas? The second piece is writing out the trauma itself, the trauma accounts. This is to help, again, process and integrate the memory. This also speaks in general to just the benefits of journaling. If you say, I don't have any traumas, it's still good to write and practice writing through your different difficult experiences. So there's many different purposes of the trauma account. I'm just going to highlight and talk through a few, but I won't go too much into detail. So number one, it's important in order to help integrate the sensory details into one cohesive memory. So this is often where we'll have them write out, not just what happened, but write it out in details. What did you hear? Using all your senses, what did you hear? What did you see? What did you smell? Let me give you an example of this. This is not from a personal client, it's from a book that I read, and I thought it was a great, simple example. Someone was driving, and they went and they stopped by Krispy Kreme donuts. They bought a big box of, maybe you can smell it, maybe you're salivating right now, and they were going to take it home, so they placed the box on their passenger seat. And they're driving home, and they get into a near-death car accident. Now, they recovered. Not only were they afraid of driving again, but oddly, one day they came across this scent that completely triggered them. Complete anxiety, almost to the point of a panic attack. It was the scent of Krispy Kreme donuts. Now, is Krispy Kreme donuts dangerous? Well, for your physical health, yes. But is it dangerous, right? Is it life-threatening in the moment that you eat it? No. So why did that person's body react in that way? The Krispy Kreme donuts, the scent of it was paired with the car accident. Now, if I had them write out this trauma account, they would realize, oh, wow, this sense of smell from that is triggering me, but it's not the scent itself. When we get triggered by people or other experiences, we have to realize it's not that itself that's the trigger, that's actually dangerous. My brain has associated it with something else. Many of you can think about the famous Pavlov's dog experiment, right, in which they paired meat powder with a bell, where dogs don't, salivate to a bell sound unless they're trained. This is what happens in our brain with trauma. Our brain associates an actual life-threatening experience with some sort of sensory experience, and so we need to write it out, all the details, to understand and integrate that sensory details into a cohesive memory. It also helps in reducing arousal through eliminating avoidance. What we don't realize is avoidance actually not only confirms but even grows fear. So let's say I had a fear of touching that door handle thing. If I touch it, I'm going to contract a virus and die. If I avoid it, what am I telling my brain? It's true. And I will tell my brain, oh, I'm safe, I'm alive because I'm not touching it. So what do I need to do to overcome that fear? I need to touch it. I could reframe my thoughts, but if I reframe my thoughts and never touch it, my brain is saying, well, you're not touching it because you're still afraid. They do this often with OCD or other disorders because those are avoidance-based disorders. The avoidance maintains the fear. I'll give you an extreme example of this. They used to have this TV show long time ago about different disorders and how to treat them. And this person was afraid of public restrooms. I'm going to contract something and die. So what did they do? The coach took them into the bathroom and had them start to touch things, but even to the point where they had them lick the toilet. Now, is that gross? Yes. But why did they have them lick the toilet? They did the very extreme to show that even if you did that, you're still safe. So we need to do the opposite of our fear if our fear is not valid. If I'm avoiding people because I'm saying people will judge me, you need to approach that situation. Now, if there's actual danger, for example, if someone's not a healthy person to be around, you might say, I'm not going to be forcing myself to have a relationship with them. But if we're avoiding thinking about the trauma, what we're doing is we're increasing and maintaining that fear. It is so rewarding for me to have my client at the very beginning write out their trauma account. They have a huge emotional response. But over time, as they continue to read it, and also they will read it to themselves. They write it, they continuously write it, but then also read it to themselves. You may have heard of the term desensitization. When you do something over and over and over again, it is a wonderful experience for them to finally read their trauma account with a recognition where it's just a memory, right? Remember that pie chart? It's just a memory. I have a client right now, she's like, I'm kind of bored talking about it because she realized there's no danger in it today. One kind of helpful thought that you can tell yourself as you approach your trauma is you have to remember it's a memory. It can do nothing to you today. It doesn't define you, but that's where we have to address the beliefs that make the trauma seem bad today. So that's eliminating avoidance and instead exposing yourself to the trauma memory while being safe. Process feelings and thoughts, past and present, before further working on changing the narrative, and then expressing and releasing emotions. But talking about making sure to expose yourself, there's a beautiful story about the hemorrhaging woman. And what's fascinating when you read the details of the hemorrhaging woman is she comes and she touches Jesus's garment, and it says that she was healed, right? Her blood was dried up. But then you ask, why did Jesus stop her? Why didn't he just allow her to keep going? And then after he has his encounter with her, then he says, your faith has made you well. And that means healed. But I thought she was already healed. Have you ever caught that discrepancy? She was physically healed when she touched him, but then he says, go, your faith has made you well. Luke provides an extra detail to the story that's really important. Jesus talks with her, and then he says, in the presence of all, she shared her story. And then when it says, your faith has made you well, that word is different than the first word about her blood being dried up. The first is a physical healing. The well is a complete healing. What Jesus had her do, she was healed physically, but if you think about the details of her story, she was ostracized from her community. She was ashamed with not only physical health issues, but financial, because it says that she gave everything, but then also probably some trauma from the providers that she had, because it says that she went to these healers and only grew worse. So what Jesus did in that moment was he restored her to the community. He restored her by having her share in the presence of all. It was a way for her to overcome her shame. And so what we see in this story is this principle of not only writing the trauma account is important to write it out for these other reasons, but it's important for us to share our stories. I love this quote that says, shame dies when stories are told in safe places. And at some point, not in the very beginning of your journey, maybe more towards the end, this is where it's important for you to share. We see this in the power of testimonies, coming to church and sharing. There's a part of healing that's also sharing the story. Now, I want to spend a few minutes on just talking about the role of emotions. I don't have time to get into this, but it's really important for all of you, even if you don't struggle with trauma, to learn how to cope with your emotions. Now, I put here these two little pictures. I've done a series and a whole talk on just emotions, and I'll refer to these resources at the end of my talk as well. But it's really important for you to have a better view of emotions. Most people have a negative view of emotions. You see this with cultures all the time. If you're overly emotional, you're deemed as weak, dramatic, sensitive, fill in the blank with a negative connotation. But what happens is we're trained to ignore our feelings, ignore our emotions. Even in Christian communities, we'll often quote, your heart is deceitful, right, above all things. And so we say, oh, emotions are bad, emotions are bad. Well, the heart is actually the mind, and it's talking about the thoughts. God designed us with these different feelings to actually guide us. I want you to think about emotions like pain. Is pain good or bad? In the moment, it doesn't feel good, and we want to ignore it, but why is pain good? It's a message, it's a signal to do something. So I want you to think about emotions as signals. They communicate to us and motivate us. If you can start asking yourself, what is this emotion communicating? And what is it motivating me to do? Now, sometimes when you ask what is it communicating, the thoughts might be wrong behind it. You might say, oh, it's communicating that I'm in danger. Then you realize I'm not actually in danger. Then you can change the thoughts. But many times we just ignore our feelings. And with people who've experienced trauma, they have all these emotions and they don't know what to do with them. You have to learn and master your emotions, how to manage those emotions. We talk as colleagues and then in our work a lot about emotional intelligence. People who are most successful in life learn how to manage their emotions. So that's just a plug for you to take some more time to pay attention to those emotions, analyze them. This quote that kind of helps you find the balance with emotions. Emotions are meant to be indicators, not dictators. So you're not going to say, every time I feel emotion, I'm going to do something and act on it. That's emotional reasoning. But they can be indicators. So make sure that you listen, and if they're incorrect, you can change the thoughts. But if they are, what is this motivating me to do? Because your emotions need to be resolved. Okay. Now, the last piece of treatment for trauma is then taking those stuck points and trying to change them. Right? You can't just recognize, oh, I'm engaging in self-blame, but not challenging them. It helps to ABC sheets, which I'll show you an example in a moment, similar to CBT, but is focused on trauma, helps you to realize that although you cannot change or have control over circumstances, you can change your response. And what's fascinating, I mentioned this book yesterday. I don't agree with everything, but I think the general premise is good. The Body Keeps the Score. He says the greatest sources of our suffering are the lies we tell ourselves. And who's the author of all lies? Satan. So we don't realize we're telling ourselves all these lies in trauma, and the greatest sources of our suffering are those lies. What I find fascinating in this book, it says this very strong point, and it talks about different therapies that don't even address those lies. So if your therapy or your healing process is never looking at beliefs and changing those lies, you're never going to have full recovery. So ABC sheets, this is what it looks like. There's different versions of this. This is specifically for trauma CPT. It's very simplified to start with. So you notice you have the event. You might say the event is I was working a shift and my patient died on my shift. Okay, this is the event. Then you say, okay, sometimes you can't immediately identify the belief, but then you say, oh, I started noticing my consequences was I was feeling really guilty, constant guilt. My recent client that was having that thought started realizing not only did I feel guilty, but the consequences was his work performance started to decline. He lost confidence in himself, even though he had been in the field for 30 years. And then the beliefs he started to notice was self-blame. I should have done more. I should have, and it was a long list of should haves. Oh, I should have, had her escorted through this other, thing, and all these should haves. And then you start looking at, are my thoughts above in column B realistic or helpful? And that's an important question because sometimes it's realistic, but is it helpful to dwell on? And for him, he started to realize, oh, that's not very realistic. He started realizing, no, I had already thought about that other option, but that other option wasn't a good option. Okay, let's eliminate that shoulda. What can I tell myself on such occasions in the future? Now, this is what we start with to start to get us warmed up to challenging our thoughts. Not to overwhelm you, but this is where we end up. And just to communicate, this is a long process of taking that thought and ripping it apart. This is where, talking about Band-Aids, you can't just tell a person you're not to blame. They have believed this for years. If someone believes, I can't trust anyone, you can't just come up to them and say, you can trust people. They need to really wrestle with these beliefs and say, what's right, what's wrong. And even sometimes I had a veteran, for example, where he was like, I'm to blame. And at the end of it, there was a portion in which he was at fault. So we're not looking for positive thinking. We're looking for truthful thinking. And he had to accept that he was to blame. But before, he was just saying, I'm to blame without any sort of full acceptance. And then he had to go through the process of repentance and forgiveness, receiving God's forgiveness, but also forgiving himself. So it's a whole process. I like to summarize it with saying, you're putting your thought on trial. You're giving it a full, fair trial in which you're listening to both sides. What's the evidence for? What's the evidence against? But oftentimes you'll notice when you start doing the evidence for, I'll have clients who are like, well, because so-and-so said so. I'm like, is that, you don't go to court and say, I think they're a murderer. You can't put evidence down if it's not evidence. So using some of these stuck points, you might say, okay, what was the trauma? What was my belief? And then you put it on trial and you say, okay, is God really punishing me? Is this really an act of God punishing me? And you have to wrestle through this. And it's this idea found in God's word from 2 Corinthians 10:5, where the context of this verse is that we don't wrestle against flesh and blood. So you're like, okay, if I know the father of all lies is attacking me in this way, the solution to this war is taking every thought captive. You start catching your thoughts and bringing them before the Lord. And the idea behind this too is that when we know the truth sets us free. That's not just applied in the spiritual sense, that's also applied in the sense of healing in trauma as well. Now, I just want to highlight two other main points. So as we heal, there's also two elements that are mostly important for healing, and that's empowerment and connection. In a book on trauma, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, he highlights this. After all, one of the defining elements of a traumatic experience, particularly one that is so traumatic that one dissociates because there's no other way to escape from it, is a complete loss of control and a sense of utter powerlessness. As a result, regaining control is an important aspect of coping with traumatic stress. If you notice that you have any sense of powerlessness in your trauma, it's not about controlling everything that you can't control. That increases your powerlessness, but you need to have a sense of empowerment. We see this in this study that was done with rats. They would put rats in this little swimming container, and about after 15 minutes, they would give up. They'd give up, and so the experimenter would, then after they gave up, would pluck them out. But then they tried this thing that before they gave up, they would pluck them out before they gave up. And then they put them back in, giving them a sense of relief. How much longer do you think that they continued to swim after they had already swam for almost 15 minutes and almost gave up? Do you think 5 more minutes, 10 more minutes? How much? Any guesses? 15? Okay, double. Anyone else? 30 minutes? Okay. 60 hours. 60 hours. You might ask why? They were expecting at some point, I'm going to be picked up again. So let me keep going. Let me keep going. This is the idea that many times our mind gives up before our bodies. I'm a runner, so that's one thing that I keep on telling myself when I want to give up. It's the idea of empowerment and hope. That when we believe that there's some sort of control in a situation, a way out, then we are able to better perform. So it's important for us to gain a sense of empowerment as we heal in our trauma. We see this also in this idea, am I going to be a victim to trauma, or am I going to be a victor, right? Choosing your own way. And then lastly, connection is really important as well. What we see in, again, a quote from this book, the most traumatic aspects of all disasters involve the shattering of human connections. And this is especially true from children. Being harmed by the people who are supposed to love you, being abandoned by them, being robbed of the one-on-one relationships that allow you to feel safe and valued and to become humane, these are profoundly destructive experiences because humans are inescapably social beings. The worst catastrophes that can befall us inevitably involve relational loss. Then it continues. As a result, recovery from trauma and neglect is also all about relationships, rebuilding trust, regaining confidence, returning to a sense of security, and reconnecting to love. Of course, medications can relieve symptoms, and talking to a therapist can be incredibly useful, but healing and recovery are impossible, even with the best medications and therapy in the world, without lasting, caring relationships with others. And that's why I'll just put a plug here. Forgiveness is absolutely essential in trauma recovery, as well as boundaries. And there's 2 podcast episodes from these lovely people here. And Amanda will be talking more on this subject, so I'm not going to cover it. But it's both connection with others, but also with God. I love this quote that talks about, as we're going through the journey of healing, the divine power combined with human effort will give to all perfect and entire victory. Every believing mind will be filled with conscious power. The language of the soul will be, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And to close, I just want to share a story that kind of motivated a lot of my own interest in trauma. And it's the story of my father. So my father was, he's Brazilian, and he grew up in Brazil. And when he was just a baby, his mom abandoned him to the doorstep of my aunt. So he was orphaned, but his aunt mistreated him, abused him, it was not her child, and she had her own children, and he became a nuisance. And so very early on, she then dropped him off at an orphanage. Orphanage after orphanage after orphanage. My father, finally at the age of 16, lived on the streets of Brazil on his own. So a history of rejection, abandonment. And at 16, he encountered this pastor, and the pastor handed him a Bible and said, "This will fix you." He was a problematic child at that time. And he read through the stories, but his favorite verse, the verse that stood out to him, was Isaiah 49, that says, "Can a mother forget the baby at her breast and have no compassion on the child she has born?" Thinking like, how, right? On the very breast, she's right here. But it's saying, you wouldn't expect that, but that happens. Though she may forget, I will never forget you. See, I have engraved you on the palms of my hands. Healing from trauma cannot occur without a personal relationship with God. My father, in that experience, some people say, if you've had those difficult experiences, you're not going to be a good father yourself. And yet my father has been a wonderful father because of his attachment with God. I love this quote, and we'll finish with this. To be loved but not known is comforting but superficial. To be known and not loved is our greatest fear. But to be fully known and truly loved is, well, a lot like being loved by God. It is what we need more than anything. It liberates us from pretense, humbles us out of our self-righteousness, and fortifies us for any difficulty life can throw at us. Thank you. All right. Well, I know I'm out of time, but I'll just, as I mentioned, I will send slides. And so the resources that I have, it'll be in the slides. Different books, different audio resources and things through Beautiful Minds as well. Thank you.